If you had stood in the vaults of the Bank of England on August 15th, 1945, you would have seen something terrifying. Empty shelves. The gold was gone. Shipped across the Atlantic in crates marked urgent. The world believed Britain had won the greatest war in human history. The photographs showed Churchill flashing his victory sign and soldiers kissing nurses in Trafalgar Square. But inside the Treasury building on Whitehall, the accountants knew a different truth. Britain had won the battlefield and lost the ledger. The empire that had financed half the world for 2 centuries was now bankrupt. Not metaphorically bankrupt, actually bankrupt. The kind of broke where you cannot buy bread without begging for credit, and the creditor was no longer a friend. It was a rival wearing the mask of an ally. I lie. This is not a story about tanks or aircraft carriers. This is a story about interest rates and loan agreements. Because empires do not die when the bullets run out. They die when the money runs out. And in 1945, Britain's money had run out completely. Before the war, London was the beating heart of global finance. The city was more than just a capital. It was the central bank of a quarter of the planet. The pound sterling was the language of international trade. From Bombay to Brisbane, from Cairo to Cape Town, business was conducted in British currency. If you wanted to buy rubber from Malaya or wheat from Canada, you needed pounds. And to get pounds, you went through London. This system was called the sterling area. It was an invisible empire more powerful than any army. Money flowed into London like rivers feeding an ocean. British banks collected fees on every transaction. British insurance companies underwrote every cargo ship. British investment houses financed railways in Argentina and mines in South Africa. The system was self-reinforcing. The world needed pounds. Britain controlled the supply. It was financial domination disguised as free trade. The Royal Navy protected the sea lanes. But the real weapon was the ledger. Britain could run deficits for decades because everyone always needed sterling. It was a privilege, a monopoly, an addiction the world could not break, until the war changed everything. To understand how the empire truly collapsed, you need to understand the cost of survival. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany with a treasury that was already stretched thin. The economy was still recovering from the Depression. Unemployment was high. Industry was old. But Britain had no choice. It mobilized everything. Factories that made sewing machines were converted to make artillery shells. Women who had never worked entered the munitions plants. The entire island became a war machine. And war machines burn money faster than fire burns paper. By 1940, France had fallen. Britain stood alone. The Luftwaffe bombed London every night for months. The government spent money it did not have on Spitfires and radar stations and anti-aircraft guns. Churchill told the nation they would never surrender. But surrender is not always a military decision. Sometimes it is a financial one. Britain was spending £1 million per day on the war effort. Think about the scale of that. £1 million. Every single day, and it had no way to earn that money back. Its export markets were cut off. Its merchant fleet was being sunk by German U-boats. The only solution was to borrow. But who lends to a country that might lose? America was the answer. The United States in 1940 was the only nation on earth with surplus capital. It had gold, it had factories, it had oil, And it had a president who understood that a German victory would be bad for American business. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but he also wanted to help America. The relationship was never a partnership of equals. It was a transaction. Britain needed weapons. America needed to break the British monopoly on global trade. The first system was called cash and carry. The name sounds innocent, but it was brutal. Britain had to pay cash up front for every rifle and every tank, not in pounds, in dollars or gold. Britain started selling everything. It liquidated American railway stocks that British investors had owned for generations. It sold shares in Argentine cattle ranches. It sold South African mining operations. The fire sale was humiliating. Assets that had taken a century to accumulate were dumped on the market at discount prices. American investors bought them for pennies on the pound. By the end of 1940, Britain was out of cash. It was out of gold. It was out of options. Churchill sent Roosevelt a letter that was essentially a confession of insolvency. He wrote that Britain could no longer pay. He begged for help. He promised that if America did not act, Britain would fall and America would face Hitler alone. Roosevelt's response was Lend-lease. It was presented to the American public as a generous act. The president used a folksy metaphor about lending a neighbor a garden hose when his house was on fire. But the lawyers and the bankers knew better. Lend-lease was not a gift. It was a hostile takeover disguised as charity. The weapons were loaned. The food was loaned. Even the oil was loaned. Britain would have to pay it all back. But buried in the Lend-lease agreements were clauses that had nothing to do with military aid. Article 7 was the poison pill. It required Britain to dismantle imperial preference. This was the system of tariffs and trade barriers that gave British companies an advantage in empire markets. It was the economic glue that held the empire together. American negotiators demanded it be dissolved. They wanted access to India. They wanted access to Africa. They wanted the British Empire to stop being a closed club and start being an open marketplace for American goods. Britain signed. It had no leverage. It was drowning. And America was offering a rope with a noose at the end. But the real crime was not what America did to Britain. It was what Britain did to India. This is the chapter that gets quietly skipped in most documentaries. To fight the war in Asia, Britain needed supplies. It needed rice and jute and steel and uniforms. India provided millions of tons of material, but Britain did not have the money to pay for it. So the colonial government in Delhi devised a brilliant and evil scheme. They printed rupees, mountains of rupees. When a British officer bought supplies in Calcutta, he paid in freshly printed Indian currency. But where did that currency come from? It was created out of thin air by the Reserve Bank of India, which was controlled by London. In exchange for printing this money, Britain deposited an IOU in a London bank account. This was called the sterling balances. On paper, India was accumulating wealth. The balance grew to 1.3 billion pounds. A staggering fortune, but it was a lie. The rupees flooding India caused catastrophic inflation. Prices doubled, then tripled. The poor could no longer afford food. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people. They starved to death while grain was diverted to British troops. This was not a natural disaster. It was a monetary policy decision. Britain was fighting the war on a credit card issued in the name of its starving colonial subjects. The biggest lender was still America. By 1944, the balance of power had shifted so far that Britain was no longer negotiating. It was obeying. The Bretton Woods Conference was sold to the public as the creation of a new international financial order. The IMF and the World Bank were born. But the real story of Bretton Woods was the execution of British financial independence. John Maynard Keynes arrived with a plan to save Britain. He proposed a new global currency called the bancor. It was designed to penalize creditor nations like America and protect debtor nations like Britain. It was a brilliant system that would have allowed Britain to recover gracefully without sacrificing its sovereignty. Harry Dexter White, the American negotiator, crushed it. He knew America held all the cards. He knew Britain was bankrupt. He insisted on a system built around the dollar and gold, a system that favored the country with the surplus. Keynes fought. He argued. He pleaded. But Britain had no leverage. It was a beggar negotiating with a king. Britain signed the Bretton Woods Agreement. It was signing away the financial architecture that had made it a superpower. Then came the guillotine. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Britain assumed that American aid would continue during the Reconstruction period. The cities were bombed. The factories were exhausted. The people were starving under the strictest rationing in British history. But President Truman had other plans. The moment Japan surrendered, he canceled Lend-lease. Not gradually, instantly. Ships that were mid-ocean carrying food to Britain were ordered to turn around and return to American ports. Britain had no dollars. It had no gold. It had no way to pay. The country that had stood alone against Hitler for a year was now being abandoned by its ally the moment the fighting stopped. Think about the cruelty of that. Think about the calculated coldness. Britain had sacrificed everything, and America turned off the tap overnight. The British government panicked. They sent Keynes back to Washington, not to negotiate, to beg. Keynes was dying. He had a heart condition. The stress was killing him. But he went to America one last time in the autumn of 1945. He asked for a gift, a grant. He argued that Britain had fought a common war and deserved common support. The Americans said no. There would be no gift. There would be a loan. And the loan would come with conditions designed to finish what the war had started. In December 1945, Britain signed the Anglo-American Loan Agreement. It borrowed $3.75 billion. It was the largest loan in history, but the interest rate was not 0. It was 2%. This shocked the British public. They had thought the alliance meant something. They had thought the shared sacrifice meant something. But the Americans were charging interest, as if Britain was a risky debtor, as if Britain might default. The humiliation was compounded by the second condition. Britain had to make sterling convertible within 1 year. This meant that anyone holding British pounds could demand to exchange them for dollars at a fixed rate. It was a trap, and everyone except the British government seemed to know it. The disaster arrived exactly on schedule. On July 15, 1947, Britain fulfilled its promise. Sterling became convertible. Within days, the world began dumping pounds and buying dollars. It was a stampede. Countries across the empire and beyond rushed to convert their sterling reserves into American currency. Britain's foreign exchange reserves drained at a terrifying rate. It was losing $100 million per week. The reserves were being annihilated. The government watched in horror as the wealth of the nation evaporated in real time. They had no choice. After 5 weeks, convertibility was suspended. But the damage was catastrophic. Confidence in the pound was destroyed. The illusion of British financial strength was shattered. Britain was revealed to be exactly what it was, a bankrupt island. Dependent on American mercy, the empire was no longer an asset. It was a burden. Maintaining garrisons in Malaya and Kenya and Egypt cost money Britain no longer had. The colonies were no longer generating profit. They were generating bills. India was the first domino. Britain owed India over £1 billion in those wartime sterling balances. It could not pay. It could not afford to keep 30,000 British soldiers and administrators in the subcontinent. It could not afford to police the rising tensions between Hindus and Muslims. So Britain left, not after careful planning, not after a gradual transition. It left in haste. The decision to grant independence was made in early 1947. The actual departure happened in August. 6 months. That was the timeline. The result was partition. 1 million people died in the communal violence that followed. Borders were drawn by a British lawyer who had never been to India and was given 5 weeks to complete the job. It was a catastrophe. But Britain did not have the money to stay. Sovereignty costs money. And Britain was broke. Palestine was abandoned the next year. Burma was let go. Ceylon gained independence. Across Africa and Asia, the pattern repeated. Britain did not fight to keep the empire. It could not afford the payroll. The 1950s brought a new illusion. Britain pretended it was still a great power. Politicians spoke about the special relationship with America. They spoke about Britain's seat at the top table. But the economy told a different story. It was trapped in a cycle called stop-go. When the government tried to stimulate growth, imports would surge. British industry was uncompetitive. People bought German cars and American appliances. Money flowed out. The pound weakened. To defend the currency, the government would raise interest rates and cut spending. Growth would stop. The cycle would repeat. Britain could not grow without bleeding foreign currency. But the politicians refused to accept reality. They clung to the fantasy that Britain was still a superpower. That fantasy crashed into the desert in 1956. The Suez Canal was the jugular vein of empire. It connected Britain to the oil of the Middle East and the markets of Asia. When Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the canal in July 1956, Britain saw it as theft. Prime Minister Anthony Eden was a man of the old imperial mindset. He believed Britain could not tolerate defiance from a former colony. He conspired with France and Israel to launch a secret invasion. The plan was simple. Israel would attack Egypt. Britain and France would intervene as peacekeepers and seize the canal. Militarily, the operation succeeded. British paratroopers secured the canal zone. The Egyptian army was routed. But the battle was not decided in Egypt. It was decided in Washington and New York. President Eisenhower was furious. He had not been consulted. He saw the invasion as a suicidal act of nostalgia that would push the Arab world into Soviet arms. He wanted the British out, and he had the weapon to force them out. He attacked the pound. The American Treasury began selling sterling on the currency markets. The value of the pound collapsed. Simultaneously, Britain needed emergency funds from the IMF to stabilize the currency. Eisenhower blocked the request. He told Eden bluntly that if British troops did not withdraw, America would crash the British economy. Britain was days away from national bankruptcy. The gold reserves were hemorrhaging. The government could not afford to keep troops in the field for another week without American support. Eden had no choice. He ordered a ceasefire and a humiliating withdrawal. Suez was the psychological end of empire. The world saw that Britain could no longer act independently. Its military power was useless because it was funded by American credit. The empire had ended not with a glorious last stand, but with a phone call from Washington threatening financial destruction. Let that sink in. Britain had nuclear weapons. It had aircraft carriers. But it could not defy America because America controlled the money. The 1960s were the decade of managed decline. Harold Macmillan gave his Wind of Change speech, acknowledging that colonialism was over. The Union Jack was lowered in dozens of capitals, but the pound remained fixed at $2.80, a rate set in 1949. By the mid-1960s, that rate was unsustainable. British exports were too expensive. The country was bleeding currency. But devaluation was seen as a national humiliation. Harold Wilson, elected in 1964, fought a desperate 3-year battle to defend the pound. He sacrificed everything. He cut public spending. He froze wages. He canceled military projects. He borrowed from central banks. It was a war of attrition against speculators. And Wilson lost. In November 1967, the pressure became unbearable. The reserves were empty. Wilson devalued the pound to $2.40. That evening he appeared on television and told the British people a lie. He said the pound in your pocket has not been devalued. It was an insult to their intelligence. Of course it had been devalued. Britain imported half its food. Prices rose immediately. The standard of living fell. The people realized their leaders were not just weak. They were dishonest about their weakness. The 1970s were the final act of humiliation. The oil shock of 1973 devastated Britain. Inflation hit 25%. Unions demanded higher wages. Strikes paralyzed the country. The lights went out. Garbage piled up in the streets. The dead went unburied. Britain was called the sick man of Europe. The government printed money to pay its bills. The deficit exploded. By 1976, the markets had seen enough. They stopped lending. The pound collapsed below $2. The government was running out of cash to pay salaries. In September, the Chancellor of the Exchequer was on his way to the airport when he received a call. The markets were in freefall. He turned the car around. Britain had to do the unthinkable. It had to apply to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The IMF was designed for developing countries. It was for nations in Latin America or Africa. It was not for Britain. The victor of World War II, the former ruler of a quarter of the globe. But Britain had no choice.